Russia looks stable on the surface, but 5 silent failures are stacking underneath it like dominoes. And once the third one falls, the rest don't even need Putin's permission. If you want to understand what's really happening to Russia right now, don't start with speeches, parades, or propaganda. Start with stress. Because empires don't usually collapse in one dramatic moment. They collapse the way a bridge collapses, quietly, invisibly, and then all at once. And the scary part for Vladimir Putin is this: Russia is now showing signs of structural stress.
The kind that spreads across banking, budgets, industry, and daily life until the system can't pretend anymore. Tonight on War News, we're breaking down 5 reasons Russia's collapse is becoming less of a possibility and more of a timeline. And stay with me, because the final reason isn't just about money. It's about something that makes leaders panic, losing control of the future. Let's get into it. On paper, Russia can still point to economic activity. Factories run, paychecks go out, the state keeps spending, and the Kremlin loves to wave around growth like it proves the system works. But here's the truth nobody in Moscow wants to say out loud. A war economy can create motion without creating health. It's like someone sprinting while bleeding. Yes, there's movement.
But that doesn't mean they're okay. When a country pumps massive resources into defense production, it can temporarily boost output, especially if the government is the buyer of last resort. But that spending comes at a cost. Civilian sectors get starved, consumer markets shrink, private investment dries up, productivity weakens. And the state becomes the only thing holding the whole structure together that might keep things from collapsing today. But it makes collapse worse tomorrow. And here's the key. Once your economy becomes dependent on war spending to look strong, you've trapped yourself. Because the moment you try to slow down, whether from sanctions, shortages, or budget pressure, the illusion disappears.
Now add another layer: inflation pressure and household pain. Even if official inflation numbers look manageable, regular people feel reality through prices, not press releases. When food, basic goods, rent, and borrowing costs keep rising, the public doesn't care what the spreadsheet says. They care that their money buys less, their options shrink, and the future feels smaller. And when that happens, something changes psychologically. People stop planning, they stop investing, they stop trusting. That's how stagnation becomes decay. And decay is a pre-collapse condition. But the next reason is where that decay shows up first, and it's the kind of place that can take a country down fast. Here's a question. When a country is under intense sanctions, high military spending, and shrinking access to global markets, where does the strain concentrate first? Answer: in the financial system. Because banks are the plumbing of the economy.
When the pipes clog, everything upstream and downstream starts failing. Businesses, workers, supply chains, even government stability. Now think about what Russian banks are facing. Higher risk loans as businesses struggle, rising defaults from households and smaller companies, limited external financing due to sanctions, a state that needs money and pushes banks to play along, a population that can panic if confidence cracks, and that last point is the killer. A modern banking system runs on belief. If people believe their deposits are safe, the system can survive stress. If they stop believing, it doesn't matter what Putin says on TV, because bank runs don't wait for permission. Now, Russia can try to manage this through controls, restrictions, emergency liquidity, temporary measures, you know the language. But every control has a price. The more you restrict the system to keep it stable, the less normal economic life can function.
And there's a second trap here. When interest rates stay high to fight inflation and protect the currency, it makes borrowing expensive. That hurts small businesses, that hurts consumers, that hurts investment. So the state faces a choice: keep rates high and choke growth, or lower rates and risk inflation and currency instability. Either path creates pain, and pain spreads. Here's the part most people miss. You don't need a total banking collapse to trigger a national crisis. You just need enough financial stress that credit stops flowing normally. Businesses can't expand, companies can't refinance, families can't afford loans, construction slows, jobs weaken. And soon the economy feels like it's running through mud. Now, keep that in the back of your mind, because it connects directly to reason number 3, which is Russia's most famous lifeline. And right now, that lifeline is fraying.
Before we go to reason number 3, if you want clear, no-nonsense breakdowns of global military and geopolitical shifts, make sure you're subscribed to War News. We don't just repeat headlines here, we connect the dots. All right, let's talk about the lifeline: energy. If Russia had a superpower economically, it's been this: sell energy to the world, tax the revenue, fund the state. For years, energy money helped Russia stabilize its budget, build reserves, and project strength. But war changes the rules. Sanctions change the rules. And here's the brutal reality. Even when Russia can still sell oil, it often sells it under conditions that drain power instead of building it. Let's break down the problem in plain English. 1. Discounts are not a strategy. They're a symptom. When buyers demand major discounts, that means Russia has less leverage. And the more Russia depends on fewer buyers, the more those buyers control the deal. If you're selling to a narrow set of customers, you're not dominant, you're dependent.
2. Logistics and enforcement pressure. Even when oil flows, it needs shipping, insurance, financing, and routes that can be disrupted. This is why the so-called shadow fleet matters. But shadow systems are expensive, risky, and vulnerable. Every seizure, every restriction, every enforcement action increases friction. Friction raises costs. Costs shrink profits. And shrinking profits shrink tax revenue, especially for a state trying to fund a long war. 3. A strong currency can actually hurt revenue. This sounds backwards, but it matters. If Russia earns energy revenue in foreign currency while budget needs are domestic, currency moves can reduce the state's take. And when the government budgets on one assumption, then reality prints a different number, the difference becomes a whole, not a theory, a whole. 4. Production decline becomes destiny. You can't squeeze a sector forever. If equipment is harder to replace, technology access shrinks and investment drops, output eventually declines. And once energy output trends down, the long-term budget picture gets ugly fast.
Now combine all of that with Russia's war spending. This is the key connection. Russia's budget isn't under pressure because the Kremlin is bad at math. It's under pressure because the war is expensive and the easiest money source is getting less reliable. So what happens? The state tries to patch the hole. More taxes, more borrowing, more pressure on companies, more temporary measures that become permanent. That might work for a year, but over time, it creates exhaustion, economic and political. And that exhaustion is exactly what sanctions are designed to accelerate, which brings us to reason number 4. There's a myth some people still believe that sanctions don't work. Sanctions absolutely can fail if the target has unlimited alternatives. But when sanctions block advanced technology, machinery, financing, and global integration, they can do something far more powerful than shock the system. They can age the system.
They turn a modern economy into an economy that's constantly substituting, cannibalizing, and improvising. And improvisation is not innovation. Here's what tech isolation does over time. Manufacturing becomes less efficient, repairs become slower and more expensive, quality declines, output becomes harder to scale, investment becomes riskier, and the economy loses competitiveness year after year. It's not a single punch, it's a tightening. Now think about what Russia needs to sustain a long conflict: precision manufacturing, electronics, optical systems, aviation and maintenance capacity, heavy equipment, skilled labor, stable supply chains, and financing that doesn't collapse under risk. Even if Russia can obtain some components through third countries, the system still pays a tax, higher costs, lower reliability, more delays. And if you're trying to run a country and a war at the same time, delays are deadly, because every delay becomes a shortage, and every shortage forces another compromise. Now let's zoom out. When a country's best talent leaves or disengages and capital avoids long-term investment, the economy loses momentum. And once momentum is gone, the future becomes a maintenance problem.
That's when countries start cannibalizing themselves, using reserves, using emergency funds, using short-term fixes, using propaganda to cover structural weakness. But the world doesn't care about propaganda. Markets don't care. Supply chains don't care. Demographics don't care. Which leads us to the final reason, the one that turns economic trouble into something far more dangerous for Putin, because this last reason attacks Russia's ability to recover. Even if Russia could survive today's pressure, here's the real question: what does Russia recover into? Because rebuilding after a long war is hard even when you have access to global capital and technology. Russia doesn't. And the longer the war runs, the worse the recovery math becomes. The frozen assets problem and why it's psychologically devastating. When a state's assets are frozen abroad, it's not just a financial hit. It's a signal. It tells elites, investors, and insiders your money isn't safe outside the system. And inside the system, it might not be safe either. That's how you trigger elite paranoia. And elite paranoia is the beginning of political instability.
Because when insiders stop trusting the leader's strategy, they start protecting themselves, not the country, themselves. Now, there's another layer. War costs don't end when the war ends. A long conflict creates veteran care burdens, equipment replacement needs, infrastructure strain, regional budget crises, labor shortages, reduced life expectancy and demographic damage, and a society trained to survive rather than prosper. Even if the Kremlin wanted to pivot to peace and growth tomorrow, the bill is already huge. And here's the twist. As the war drags on, the government becomes more dependent on coercion, censorship, financial controls, forced narratives, and increasingly centralized decisions. That type of system can look strong until it suddenly looks brittle.
Because when everything depends on one decision maker, every failure points to one person. And once that perception spreads, the leader's biggest weapon, fear, loses efficiency. Because people start thinking, if things keep getting worse anyway, what am I afraid of? Now add one more factor: internal competition. In long wars, different factions fight for resources. Military priorities versus regional budgets. Security services versus economic managers. Oligarch interests versus state demands. Central planners versus reality. If revenue shrinks while demands grow, those factions don't unite. They fight, quietly at first, then openly. And that's the moment when collapse stops being purely economic. It becomes political. Now, does that mean Russia collapses tomorrow? No, but it does mean this. Russia is moving into a phase where time is the enemy. And the longer Putin stays on this path, the fewer options Russia has that don't involve massive pain. That's why collapse becomes a matter of time. Not because one thing goes wrong, but because 5 major systems are all under pressure at once.
A war economy hollowing out civilian life, banking stress that can freeze credit and confidence, energy revenue, losing power as a lifeline, industrial aging from sanctions and tech isolation. A stolen future, assets, recovery capacity, and elite trust, put those together and you don't get a temporary slump. You get a country that's forced to choose between bad choices, and that's where history gets written. So here's the question I'll leave you with. When a government spends years telling its people that sacrifice leads to victory, what happens when sacrifice leads to less? Less money, less opportunity, less stability, less future. That's when slogans stop working. And that's when systems start cracking from the inside. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to War News, because we're tracking the shifts that actually matter, not just the headlines. And tell me in the comments, which of these 5 pressure points do you think breaks first? Banking, energy revenue, or internal political trust? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.